12, beginning in verse 23. But Jesus answered them, saying, "The hour has come that the Son of Man should be glorified. Most assuredly I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it produces much grain. He who loves his life will lose it, and he who hates his life in this world will keep it for eternal life. If anyone serves me, let him follow me, and where I am, there my servant will be also. If anyone serves me, him my Father will honor. Now my soul is troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? But for this purpose I came to this hour. Father, glorify your name." Then a voice came from heaven saying, "I have both glorified it and will glorify it again." Therefore the people who stood by and heard it said that it had thundered. Others said, "An angel has spoken to him." Jesus answered and said, "This voice did not come because of me, but for your sake. Now is the judgment of this world. Now the ruler of this world will be cast out, and I, if I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all peoples to myself." This he said, signifying by what death he would die. I want to thank you this evening for inviting me to come and be a part of this summer series. I really mean it when I say I am truly honored to be a part of it. I look at the list of some of those names of other speakers who have been here. Don't know that I'm quite worthy of being here with some of them, but I do appreciate it very much. I'm glad that Leah was able to join me this year. Last year, I was here, but she wasn't able to be here. If I was going to add one thing to my bio, we're expecting another little one come January. January 27th is the due date, so I guess we're about 15 weeks or so along right now. And so I know she's got a great history with the congregation here, and you guys know her and love her, and I know she loves you too. Glad that she could be here with you this evening. My topic this evening is the crucifixion of Jesus. And I have to tell you, when Roger told me what I was going to be talking about, it was kind of a mix of both excitement and great soberness. And I have to tell you, in all my years of preaching, have never prepared a sermon just strictly about the death of Jesus somehow. And so it was exciting at the prospect of it. But I'll tell you what, over the course of the last couple months as I've been working on this sermon, I've shed quite a few tears. I guess it's one of those subjects that kind of has that effect on you. Well, as I started preparing, I realized there is an awful lot that I could say about it. There are so many different directions that you could go and so many different angles that you could come from in talking about the death, the crucifixion of Jesus. And yet as I was contemplating it, there was one text that kept coming to my mind. It was the one from John chapter 12 that I just read to you. That has always struck me as a powerful text. The imagery that Jesus uses there, the emotion that had to be a part of it, a profound passage. And so I decided I was going to use that passage to sort of navigate the scene of the crucifixion. I want to give you a little bit of context here just so we completely understand what's going on in this passage. It's the feast week of the Passover. In the first verse of chapter 12, we read 6 days prior to Passover Day, Jesus and his disciples came to the nearby city of Bethany. And of course, we remember the story of him having supper with his friends, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus there. Well, the next day, it tells us in verse 12, we find Jesus on that hill overlooking the city of Jerusalem. We read the events of the triumphal entry. We read that Jesus weeps over the city, knowing the impending doom that will come in a few short years. Well, it's sometime during this week, sometime between that triumphal entry and Passover Day, that our text takes place. It may have been 2 or 3 days before the crucifixion, but it was certainly no more than that. Knowing that Jesus is in town, obviously, he gets a lot of attention. Some of the Greek Jews there in Jerusalem request an audience with him, and when Jesus is asked, those verses that I just read for you were actually his response. It's believed by a lot of scholars that these were actually the last public words of Jesus before his death. And so here's the scene. Jesus knows in just a matter of days, he's going to be hanging on a cross. He knows besides the physical part of that anguish, he knows he's going to be betrayed and cursed. He knows he's got a long, hard night ahead of him as well. And it's very clear from this text that all this is sitting very much at the forefront of Jesus' mind. And so with all this weighing very heavy on his heart, Jesus speaks of what's coming. Verse 23 says, "But Jesus answered them, saying, the hour has come." I want to stop right there. The hour has come. You notice Jesus doesn't say an hour has come. Jesus doesn't say an hour in which something, something, something has come. No, Jesus says the hour has come. That in itself tells us this is not a common hour. This is not going to be an hour just like every other hour in the world. No, Jesus says it's the hour. In Vincent's word studies, Vincent says that this hour is recognized as being absolute. That means that it's as though this hour has an identity, a personality all its own, completely distinct from any other hour in the history of this world. This is truly the defining hour. You know, Jesus, in talking about the hour, I think it gives us some really interesting insight into what must have been going on in his mind. You know, this isn't the first place in the Bible that we read about Jesus' hour or his time. In fact, there in the book of John, John references Jesus' hour or his time again many, many times. It's actually sort of a theme in the book. Now, all the times up to this point, in talking about Jesus' time, so far it has been said his time had not yet come. You know, I think it's really interesting because almost always when we find this hour referenced, it's talking about Jesus in Jerusalem. John clearly makes a connection between the city of Jerusalem and this hour, the crucifixion of Jesus. And he's not the only one. In John chapter 7, verses 6 and 8, Jesus himself, at the prospect of traveling from Jerusalem, traveling to Jerusalem for the Feast of the Tabernacles, Jesus said to his brothers, "My time has not yet come." And so it seems to me that whenever Jesus comes to Jerusalem, or whenever Jesus thinks about coming to Jerusalem, his mind turns to the cross. You know, that's something he clearly lived with a constant awareness of, always in the back of Jesus' mind. Maybe sometimes a whole lot closer to the forefront of his mind looms that cross. Now, it's my understanding that the Feast of Tabernacles was one of 3 feasts that all Jewish males were expected to attend in Jerusalem every year. So if Jesus is 33 years old, as we commonly say he was, that means that Jesus would have made this trip probably 100 or more times in his life. We know that the location of Calvary, where he was crucified, was right along the main road into the city of Jerusalem on the northern side of it. So think about it. He's coming from the north, coming from Galilee. And so, over 200 times coming and going, he has passed the very spot where he would be crucified. I wonder how many times he looked over at that hill and could almost feel those nails in his hands. You know, if you knew where you were going to die and when you were going to die, let's just suppose you knew that one of these days you were going to die in a car accident by hitting a tree alongside the road, and this is a road that you travel all the time. I imagine every single time you drove past that tree, you'd look over and a little shiver would kind of go down your spine, wouldn't it? I wonder if that's how it was with Jesus when he thought of that cross, when he thought of Jerusalem. What we know is that Jesus lived with a constant awareness of this hour. I really believe in Jesus' mind there was sort of like a countdown. His life was a countdown. There was a ticking clock. It's as though the hourglass had been turned over and the grains of sand were falling, always counting down to the hour. But I'll tell you what, I'd contend that this was a whole lot more than just a personal countdown to Jesus of his own life, but rather the hourglass of the entire history of this world, the hourglass of the entire course of this world was counting down to that very same hour. If I was to ask you, what do you suppose is the most well-known, most recognized image in all of the world, what would you say? Now, I don't have any data to back this up. I couldn't find any information online about it. But I don't suppose it would be a stretch to say that the most famous image in all of the world is the image of a cross. There are crosses all over this world. They're on our Bibles. They're in our church buildings. They're on our church buildings. Some people decorate the walls of their house with a cross, or even their yard with a cross. People wear crosses around their necks. They wear crosses in their earlobes. I figure there's a pretty good reason for that. It's because that cross represents truly the most critical hour in the history of the world. The hour that outshined every other hour that's ever been, the pivotal hour of all time. The entire course of the world hinged on that hour. You know, the hour is not an hour like so many other people would consider maybe the greatest hours in the world. The hour was not Independence Day of some nation. The hour was not the signing of some peace treaty or document. It was not the conquest of a new world. It was not a great invention that changed the world. The hour that defined the world was a death. Because that death would accomplish more and affect more people for more time than any invention or revolution or conquest or ruler ever would. Why? Why is that hour so significant? I think you know the answer to that. I'm going to take you there anyway. Let's rewind. Rewind the scene all the way back to almost the beginning of time, all the way back to the book of Genesis, to the Garden of Eden. We know how the story of Adam and Eve unfolded. Adam and Eve, they've eaten the forbidden fruit. As a result, mankind is doomed. The floodgates of hell and sin have been opened. In chapter 3, we know God pronounces the consequences for this sin. What are the consequences? Death. Physical death, yes. But we also know from passages like Romans chapter 5, spiritual death, too. And so from that point on, to every single person who ever sinned, all they really had to look forward to was an eternity in hell. I'll tell you what, if the story ended there, it would be a mighty dismal story, wouldn't it? But thank God, the story didn't end there. With the punishment, with that awful reality of death, God also gave a glimmer of light, a glimmer of hope. With the punishment came a promise, a way of reconciliation. You remember, as part of the serpent's punishment in verse 15 of Genesis 3, God revealed, and I'm paraphrasing here, that one of these days someone would be born, the seed of a woman. We all know who that's talking about. That's talking about Jesus. And essentially, one of these days, Jesus would come into this world. He and Satan would face off in a battle for the souls of mankind, and Jesus was going to win. You remember the way it's put? Jesus would crush the serpent's head, but what was it going to cost him? The serpent would bruise his heel. I think we also know what that's talking about. That's talking about what we're talking about tonight. And so if you think about it, from that moment on, if you want to be technical, even before that, but from that moment on, when sin entered this world, the hourglass had been turned over. The sand has been running, the clock has been ticking, counting down to that hour. Years passed. Centuries passed. Nations rise and fall. Rulers are born and die. Treaties are signed and broken. New worlds are discovered and become old news, and all the while, sin still reigned. Hell still awaited. For thousands of years, God's people offered animal sacrifices as a temporary appeasement. Millions and millions and millions of gallons of animal blood were shed, and yet we know for every gallon upon gallon of blood that was shed, it could never even take away one single sin. Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 4. And so still, through it all, out there on the horizon, loomed that hour. Prophecies came to men, looking to that hour. Psalm 22:16, his hands and his feet would be pierced. Verse 18 of the same chapter, for his clothing they'd cast lots. Zechariah 11 and verse 12, he'd be sold for 30 pieces of silver. Zechariah 17 and verse 3, the shepherd would be struck and the sheep scattered. Isaiah 50 and verse 6, I gave my back to those who struck me and my cheeks to those who plucked out the beard. I did not hide my face from shame and spitting. Isaiah 53, 4. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement for our peace was upon him. And by his stripes we're healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way. And the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. Well, the prophets came and they went. And all the while the clock was ticking. The sand was falling, counting down to that hour. Until finally, the hour, the defining hour of all time, came. Romans chapter 5 and verse 6, in due time, that is at the right or the proper time according to God, it came. Galatians 4:4, when the fullness of time had come. Hebrews chapter 9 and verse 26, now, once, at the end of the ages, the hour had come when the sinless Son of God, bearing in his own body the sins of the entire world, was led to Calvary, to that cross, to pay our debt. I don't need to tell you, because you've already been talking about it in this series. He's already been through so much. Before he even went to that cross, his body was battered and shattered, shredded, bloodied. He was marched through the winding streets of Jerusalem, up and down with that cross hanging from his tattered back, to that same spot on the northern side of the city that no doubt had troubled his mind many, many times before. And then, in what seems to me must have been the ultimate act of irony, ingratitude, betrayal in the entire history of the world, his own creation. He's the one that created them. Colossians 1:16 and 17. Jesus' own creation, who he fearfully and wonderfully made, who he gave gifts, talents, intellect, in the hopes that they would use those things for good and the glory of God. But instead, these same people had taken those God-given gifts and talents, that God-given intellect, and used it to devise a means of torture that would maximize a person's suffering. Crucifixion. You know, the gospel accounts really don't give us a ton of detail about crucifixion. Most of them simply say, and they crucified him. We look to secular history for a little bit more information on this, and what we find out is that it truly was as brutal a practice as has ever been. As a part of it, sometimes the victim was impaled through the groin with a sharpened stake. Sometimes they were tied to a cross with ropes. Sometimes they were nailed. The Bible indicates in John 20:27, Psalm 22:16, Jesus was nailed through the hands and the feet. The victim's arms were stretched out across a wooden beam. In a typical Roman crucifixion, the nails would have been driven above the wrists and between the bones of the forearm, the radius and the ulna. The Greek word for hand actually could mean anything from the elbow to the fingertips. And when the body was hung vertically, with the arms outstretched and so much of the body weight pulling downward, it caused hyperexpansion of the chest and the lungs, which made it incredibly difficult to breathe. And as if Jesus hadn't been through enough already, I say, this is where the real torture came in. For every breath, one being crucified was forced to flex the muscles of the arms and the chest, pull himself up against those nails in his wrists. The torture was really a combination of the nails grinding between the ligaments and the bones and the physical exhaustion from the constant pulling upward. Medical science says that the average person takes 12 to 20 breaths per minute at rest. The average person takes 40 to 50 breaths per minute laboring. I'm going to use an extremely conservative number here. Let's just suppose Jesus was taking 20 breaths per minute. You realize that is 1,200 times in an hour. 1,200 times he would have had to pull himself up against those nails for a breath. You realize over the course of 6 hours on that cross, he would have had to pull himself up 7,200 times. Again, this is an extremely conservative estimate. Jesus is suffering on that cross. It was not one moment of agony. It was thousands and thousands and thousands of moments of agony. This was not a death that was meant to kill a person instantly. This was not something that was created to just get it over with and put it behind you. No, it was meant to torture a person for hours, if not days. It just went on and on and on and on. Ultimately, crucifixion could be a death from really any number of things. A ruptured heart, hypovolemic shock, dehydration, heart failure, acidosis, pulmonary embolism. Sometimes they were eaten alive by animal scavengers. Usually it was a combination of exhaustion and asphyxiation. That is, after hours or days on a cross, finally somebody just got to the point they couldn't pull themselves up anymore. And they slowly suffocated to death, drowning, as it were, in the air. Crucifixion truly was a conglomeration of all the worst tortures that mankind could imagine. Quite literally, Jesus' experience on the cross was excruciating. That's what the word means. The Latin word for excruciating, out of crucifying. In fact, in Latin, you could literally translate the word excruciating. The overwhelmingly intense pain of the cross. And so when that Jerusalem mob cried out, "Crucify him," they didn't just want to see him die. They wanted to see him in abject misery. Think about this. Hebrews chapter 6 and verse 6 says of Christians who fall away, they crucify again for themselves the Son of God and put him to an open shame. This one might even hit a little closer home. Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 29 tells us when we sin willfully, that is, when we know something is wrong and we just go ahead and do it anyway, it is as though we are taking that poor body of Jesus off the cross, throwing it on the ground, and stomping on it. You realize what you're doing when you choose sin? Are we any better than the Jews who cried, "Crucify him"? Well, not only was there the physical element of it, crucifixion was meant to humiliate. The crucified was to be an example to the rest of society, a punishment that was there to dissuade others from, ironically enough in the case of Jesus, committing the same crimes. Usually when we see artists' renderings of Jesus, he's wearing some kind of a loincloth, some sort of garb wrapped around his waist. That's not how it was. Jesus was stripped naked and put on that cross. That's how they did it. For a humble, modest man of God, that in itself would be a shame. He was crucified along a main road into the city so that everybody could see. And so there he hung, naked, helpless, gasping for every breath, and all the while being glared at and jeered at by the masses. Mark 15 and verse 29 says, even the passers-by, the people that were just walking on the road about their business, wagged their head at him and mocked him. So there's the humiliation element too. Again, not only was it a conglomeration of the worst physical torments that mankind could come up with, it was a conglomeration of the worst emotional, psychological torments that mankind could conjure up too. We've seen those artists' renderings of Jesus on the cross, haven't we? This handsome man, beautiful flowing hair with a couple drops of blood coming out of his hands and maybe a tiny drip coming from his forehead. That's not what it looked like. In Isaiah chapter 52 and verse 14 it says, "His visage was marred more than any man, and his form more than the sons of men." One translation words that he was so battered he did not look human. And so we see Christ. You remember Christ, Philippians chapter 2. Christ, from that state of glory and equality with the Father in heaven, reduced to this. Truly, this hour was the cruelest hour ever experienced by a human being. In looking to that hour in our text in John 12, Jesus said in verse 27, "Now my soul is troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour. But for this purpose I came to this hour." See, Jesus didn't relish the prospect of dying on that cross. He was troubled by it. Isaiah 53:3, he was called a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. Acquainted means he knew it well. His life was not a carefree one. It wasn't easy. That cross loomed large on the horizon of Jesus' mind long before he ever went to it. And yet he knew he had to go to it because this was an hour of unparalleled purpose. That's the word he used. No one ever lived a life of purpose like that. In essence, Jesus in this verse is saying, that's why I'm here. That's why I was born. I was born to die. Can you imagine living with that? Born to die. Jesus didn't come here to live life like so many of us sometimes think is the purpose of life. He didn't come to live it up. He didn't come to pursue the pleasures of this world or indulge in all the things that this world has to offer. He didn't come to get more and more possessions and drive a nicer car and have houses. The main goal of Jesus coming here was not, like sometimes I think we think it is, to be as comfortable as possible. No. The purpose he came for was to die for people like us who think that. He didn't come to get married. He didn't come to have a family of his own or anything of his own. Truly, Jesus' mantra as he lived his life was none of self. That was the mindset that guided his entire life, the entire path to the cross, and even as he hung on that cross, it was still none of self. You realize on that cross, we see Jesus. Rather than bemoaning his state, rather than seeing only himself and his misery, what did he see? He saw his mother, made sure she was taken care of. He saw a disciple who not too long before had tucked his tail and ran away when things got hard. And he still loved him and had enough faith in him to entrust the care of his mother to him. He saw a thief and forgave him. He saw the people who crucified him and said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do." It's a lot of remarkable things we see from Jesus on the cross. One of the most remarkable things to me from that scene on the cross, though, is actually what he did not do. Jesus did not sin. You realize how hard that must have been? All his life, he's been able to resist temptation, the same kind of temptation that we face. All those years, he's been able to face it. And you think about a few times in his life when he was faced with extraordinary temptation. Matthew chapter 4 and Luke chapter 4, when he's led into the wilderness and tempted, after 40 days and 40 nights. We might think that was bad, but I would contend that the greatest temptation to sin that Jesus ever faced must have been at this hour. As he hung there on that cross, those hours, they must have seemed so long. Those minutes must have ticked by so slowly. And Jesus must have had so much on his mind. The case is with me anyway. I don't know if you're the same. When you've got a lot of time and nowhere to go, my mind kind of kicks into overdrive. And And it's times like that it can be really easy for my mind to start wandering to some really dark places, especially if I feel like I've been wronged, especially if somebody has hurt me. Tell you what, it would have been so easy for doubt and anger and resentment to set in Jesus' mind, and that could have so easily turned into sin. You know, when I get upset, this is me showing you my weakness here, I guess. Things down in my mind. Now, Leah would tell you I'm a slow thinker. I'm not quick-witted. I'm a slow thinker. But if I really have time to break something down in my mind and form my arguments and really analyze the situation and make my accusations and just analyze all the parts of it, I can get worked up into a real bitter, nasty, sinful mindset real fast. Jesus had time to think. Jesus had an argument. Jesus had an accusation. I'll tell you what, if anybody ever had an accusation against somebody else, it was Jesus against humanity. He could have dwelled on that. Think about the scene. For every single breath, he's pushing against the nail in his feet. He's pulling the entire weight of his body against those nails in his arms, feeling them grind between the bones. Maybe his skin, his tendons tearing a little bit more each time for every single breath. And all the while, he's got all this stuff on his mind that he's already been through. He's hearing the curses, the jeers of the passersby. He can look down and see the chief priests, the Pharisees, mocking him, gloating over themselves. He hears the obnoxious thief next to him, reviling him. All this ringing in his ears. It would have been so easy to sin. He didn't. You know something else that Jesus didn't do on the cross that I find completely amazing? He didn't just end it. He could have. You realize that, right? Hanging on that cross, he could have said, "These people are not worth it. Forget them." He might have been right. He could have ended it right there. You remember at his arrest in Matthew 26 and verse 53, what he told Peter? He said, "Don't you know that I could pray to my Father and he could send more than 12 legions of angels and they would deliver him?" Don't you know he still had that power as he was hanging on the cross too? Can you imagine Jesus knowing that he had that power? All he had to do was blink an eye. All he had to do was think the thought. And he could end his suffering that fast. Can you imagine knowing you had that power and not using it? One of my favorite, I think one of the most thought-provoking songs that we sing, 10,000 Angels. Because I love that song so much because we're reminded that every step of the way, every step of Jesus' path to the cross, even hanging on it, he had the power to stop it. He could have called 10,000 angels to destroy the world and set him free. When he was arrested, he could have called 10,000 angels. When he was mocked, he could have called 10,000 angels. When he was beaten and cursed and spit on and scourged, he could have said, "Forget it, enough. 10,000 angels, come on." As he felt the tips of those nails starting to pierce, he could have said, 10,000 angels, bring them. After he hung on that cross for an hour, suffering for every single breath, he could have called 12 legions of angels. After he hung there for 2 hours, and 3 hours, and 4 hours, and 5 hours, at any moment he could have ended it. But he didn't. There was something that held him on that cross, and it wasn't the nails. It was love that held Jesus on that cross through it all. Verse 24 of our text. Most assuredly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it produces much grain. Who's the grain of wheat there? Easy question, right? Jesus is the grain of wheat. Think about that. He was already alive. His life, his existence was not contingent on coming here and going to that cross. Jesus' hope of heaven did not depend on him dying on that cross. He didn't need this. He already had it all. He didn't come here because it was better for him. He came here because it was better for us. Well, that same love is what held him on that cross through all those long, grueling hours, not because he wanted to live, but because he wanted us to live. He wanted us to have a chance of experiencing what he knew in heaven. Love held him on that cross, and it held him there, until he could say, it's finished. John 19 and verse 30, and bowing his head, he gave up his spirit. It was finished. He did it. Thank God he did it. The hour was past. The defining hour of all time was past. The last moment had ticked away. The last grain of sand had fallen. The sun had gone out hours before. But now in this moment we read that the earth quaked and the rocks were split, the dead were raised, the veil in the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, Matthew 27. Guys, there was something so epic about this moment that it literally shook the world. All creation was moved by this moment. And as it was though the creation itself in its own way was crying out, there's something different here. There's something special about this hour. Something has changed. And we know the world has never been the same. The serpent's head was crushed. The ruler of this world was cast down. Sin and death were defeated. I ask you in your mind's eye to see that grain of wheat fall into the ground. See that grain of wheat as the last sparkle of life fades away. Is it sad? Yeah, it's kind of sad. In a sense, it's really sad. I hope it makes us kind of sad. But Jesus didn't choose to dwell on that part of it. Jesus didn't call this hour an hour of sadness. He didn't call it an hour of pain or suffering. He called it an hour of glory. Glory for him and glory for us too. I ask you to see in your mind's eye that seed again. Again, see it as the very last life fades away. And at that very moment, a sprout. Hope. New life. Now I want you to do this. Envision a field of wheat. Alive, growing, beautiful field of wheat that stretches from horizon to horizon, glowing in the light of the loving sun. You know who that is? That's us. That's us. All coming from that one grain of wheat that had died. All this life, new, beautiful, abundant life, because that one grain of wheat gave himself to die 2,000 years ago. Isaiah spoke of that seed, that field of wheat, as it were. In Isaiah chapter 53, after the parts where he talks about the suffering of the Messiah, he actually takes us to a scene beyond the cross. That is, after everything was said and done. And it's almost in that text as if Jesus is looking back now on everything that's happened, contemplating all of it in the big picture. One of the things that fascinates me, verse 10, says, "He shall see his seed." He sees us. Jesus sees those who were made alive by his sacrifice. And how does he feel about this? Verse 11. "He shall see the labor of his soul and be satisfied." When Jesus sees the souls who have been saved by his sacrifice, it gives him joy. When Jesus sees one person give their life to him, truly, sincerely giving their life to him, trusting and obeying him, it gives him joy. He is satisfied knowing that he could make it possible for us to live. When he sees us, it's as though Jesus is saying, it was worth it. It was all worth it. A love like that, beyond my comprehension. The defining moment in the history of all time. Maybe this will be the defining hour of your life. Maybe this will be the hour that you die to self and sin. Will this be the hour you are made a new creation with new life watered with the blood of Jesus? Will this be the hour that you come believing and repenting, confessing Christ as your Lord, being baptized, washed in that blood for the remission of your sins? Will this be the hour that you finally make it up in your mind and heart to get it right? I've been struggling for a while. I can't commit. Will this be the hour that you commit? Will it be the defining hour of your life? Will this be the hour that you repent publicly? Will this be the hour you come forward asking for whatever we can do to help? Because if we can help you, we'd love to. Roger would be glad to do that, I'm sure, as we stand and sing.